Well, joining me now is Spencer Critchley, Democratic strategist and former communication advisor for the Obama campaign. Good morning to you. Are you surprised that we are still seeing protesters out on the streets of America?
It's remarkable, and it is, in one sense, surprising. But on the other hand, we've been wondering for a long time under President Trump, why isn't there more marching in the streets? And I think the horrible death of George Floyd was just the catalyst for this. I think it's obviously building grief and anger over the treatment of Black and brown people in this country going back centuries. But it's also everything else that's been going on under Donald Trump. And I think that, unfortunately, it took the death of George Floyd to trigger this.
How do you see this developing, i.e. how much longer will the protest continue? And what intervention might we see from Donald Trump? Up until now, he's been quite bellicose about the protesters, saying that a heavier hand is needed.
Yeah, and he's only making things worse. And I would have no doubt that these protests have gone on longer than they might have if we had a president who had basic human relation skills, who essentially was capable of feeling empathy. I seriously think that our president has something wrong with him, and I actually feel some compassion for him. I think something terrible must have happened to him in his childhood. He seems incapable of identifying with other people's pain. His whole militaristic approach is deeply wrong and deeply un-American, and only highlighting the problem that these by far peaceful protesters are pointing out.
But yet, up until now, he seems to be satisfying the needs and wants of his base.
It's a shrinking base. I have a new book about this, if I may, called Patriots of Two Nations. And I think one way of understanding what's going on in the United States is there's a division between essentially two nations occupying one territory that goes back to the founding. The people who follow Donald Trump, it's easy to dismiss them as ignorant or racist or these things. And, you know, it's true of some of them. A lot of it is that they think differently, and loyalty is more important to them, and faith is more important to them than reason and the kind of Enlightenment values on which the United States was founded. And that base, I think, is starting to abandon him, not so much because of rational arguments, of which there are no end, but because they're seeing his unworthiness of their loyalty. They're seeing his total incompetence, his cowardice, and his deep dishonesty.
They would point to his successes, though. The unemployment figures that were released yesterday were by no means as depressing as they were thought to be. So that's a success that they will point to. In fact, 2.5 million were added to the payrolls in May, and that's from the Labour Department.
Yeah, surprising everybody, including him. And he, of course, is seizing eagerly on those like he seizes on daily stock figures, you know, and you live by them and die by them. That argument it strikes me when people make that argument, but look at the economy, because essentially what they're saying is my principles are for sale. I mean, who cares what is happening with the economy? And you know, we could argue about whether he deserves any credit for it all. I would say, no, he does not. He inherited a great economy and has been destroying it. He's great at inheriting wealth and destroying it. But that should be beside the point, given the awful things he's been doing to our country and to democracy itself. So again, if you're going to point to economic figures and use that to justify his awful behavior, you're essentially saying your principles are for sale.
And how does Joe Biden compare? We've had him have to retract the statement that he made that if you know, to the African-American community in America, that if they don't vote for him, that they ain't black, essentially. How does he fare against the president?
Well, you know, of course, we can't predict the future. And if anything ever taught us that lesson again, it was the 2016 result. But that said, I would say all the relevant signs are pointing to a Biden victory. I actually think he's running a smart campaign under his new leadership. He's running on the basic advantage of being a decent human being who's highly qualified for the office, which should be a decisive advantage. But also, I think that what they're doing is, instead of engaging with Trump on his, low, sleazy terms, they're showing us what a President Biden would be like. And that is a much more hopeful vision than the candidate of fear that he's running against. And I think that people are hungry for a leader like a President Biden. So that's what I believe President Biden, or soon to be President Biden, I hope, is showing Americans.
You would say that, wouldn't you? Spencer Critchley, thank you very much for speaking to us this morning.
My pleasure.